Thanks very much. Not easy being the last speaker after so many stories, I've got to tell you. But Derryn Nigel Hinch. How could a cub reporter from Taranaki ever be called Nigel? Oddly enough, Sam Neill, who we mentioned, who sadly died just hours before Derryn, was also a Nigel. Nigel John Neill. Understandably, he opted for Sam. What was it about boy babies in New Zealand in the 1940s getting saddled with the moniker Nigel? Whatever. Derryn Nigel was always just Hinch. Like Willisey, like Negus, like Bert, big enough character to need only one name. Hinch was certainly big enough and loud enough. He was born with a megaphone for a voice. His typewriter was just about as loud. There was nothing subtle about Hinch or his endless opinions. More controversial than contrary, I think. He was brave and brash, with an ego that could light up a small city. But he was also very likeable, and I liked him a lot. He got me to launch his first novel and his last book about life as a senator. He actually wrote 15 books. 2 of them were about Scrabble, because he loved words. 6 were about himself, because he quite liked himself as well. I first met Hinch, as Derryn said, in 1969, 57 years ago. Time is a freight train, as Bob Dylan said, it moves too fast. I was sent to New York, again repeating as the ABC's North American correspondent. Hinch had already been there for just over a year as bureau chief for Fairfax newspapers, the Sydney Morning Herald, but most especially the Sydney afternoon tabloid, The Sun. He'd already reported, as we heard tonight, on the assassinations of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King and much, much more. Together we covered the end of the Vietnam War, Nixon's fall from grace, Man on the Moon, etc., for the best part of a decade. Hinch was the best tabloid reporter whom I ever met. Now, it's a great skill to be a tabloid reporter, telling stories that people really want to read. He had a great nose for a story. He wrote quickly and he wrote colourfully, he wrote well. Hinch was never worthy and certainly never boring. We became good friends, but he was always a fierce competitor. I don't think I ever saw Hinch beaten on a story, on a yarn. He was often matched, but never beaten. Let me tell you a couple of war stories, the true stories from the early days when Hinch the journalist, was pretty much on fire. Hinch loved journalism. He loved their craft. His best New York mate at the time was another Kiwi journalist named Neil Travis, who worked for the competition for the Daily Mirror. Hinch and Travis always caught up for a drink at their Midtown pub in New York on a Friday afternoon after the city papers had been put to bed for the week, and it was a ritual for them. Hinch got there early on this particular Friday in 1970. A Latin American journalist, who's also at the bar, mentioned to Hinch that according to a vague wire service report, somebody called Ronnie Biggs had just been arrested in Brazil. Biggs was the great train robber who'd been secretly living in Melbourne, in fact working at Channel 9 for a while, after escaping from jail in London years earlier. He was the most wanted man in the world at the time, and MI5 was reportedly on his trail coming to Melbourne. Hinch told the barman to tell his mate Travis, his competition, that he'd just gone to collect something and to stay put, which Travis did for the rest of that Friday night. Hinch, meanwhile, had caught a Pan Am jet flight to Rio. Without a visa, he talked his way through customs and into the prison, where he interviewed Biggs through the bars in his cell. Neil Travis, his mate, got the news the next day from his Sydney editor that Hinch had the exclusive, the front page story with photographs. And to compound the felony, a panicked Travis flew to Rio, first class, was the only seat he could get, but also without a visa, just a New Zealand passport like Hinch. The Brazilians turned Travis around at the airport and sent him straight back to New York. For years afterwards, at their village pub, with somebody who didn't know the story, Hinch would say, "Hey, Neil, tell them about Ronnie Biggs." Then he'd laugh, and he'd buy Travis another drink. I had my own colourful encounter with Hinch a few years later. We were both at the United Nations covering a speech by the Australian Foreign Minister then, a guy named Nigel Bowen. It was the only time Hinch ever bothered to go to the UN. Far too boring, far too worthy for him. I was there regularly for the ABC, and I ribbed him about losing his way in the endless corridors of the UN. It was a suitably dull speech, which I duly filed for the ABC News Bulletins. A few hours later, I got a frantic call from my editor in Sydney. "What about the Indonesian walkout?" he asked. A bit baffled, I said I was there. It didn't happen. There was no walkout. "Well," he snapped, "Hinch has the bloody story on the front page of The Sun. Indons snub Australia," quoting unnamed sources. So a bit anxious, I rang the Indonesians whom I knew. No, they laughed. Our Foreign Minister, Adam Malik, was the next speaker after the Australians. He just paid a visit to the bathroom. He went for a leak before he had to speak. He actually said nice things about Australia, and he did. So I rang Hinch and told him what had really happened. "So who are your unnamed sources?" I asked. He cackled and he said, "Well, me, actually," meaning himself. Anyway, he said it was a crap speech, but a quick question, Sunshine. As you heard tonight, he called everybody Sunshine. "A quick question, Sunshine. Where did your story run?" I said, "Oh, about number 5 in the bulletin." "Yeah," he reminded me. "Well, I got front page on 2 editions of The Sun, so bugger off." He actually said something else, but I won't repeat it. There were other occasions when Hinch genuinely scooped everybody, certainly most of the other Australian newspaper reporters in America. Like in the summer of 1969, I'd just been in America for 2 hectic months when a couple of crazy music entrepreneurs decided to hold a rock festival in upstate New York. I drove up the next day when it promised to be an unmitigated disaster. The roads were choked with cars and wandering people. It was a torrential rainstorm, and the half-built stage was in an empty, muddy cow paddock, filled with hippies and sleeping bags. I reported on the first night of this pretty sad event with a drenched Richie Havens and his guitar on stage alone, threatened with lightning strikes. And like almost every other Aussie journalist, and even the New York Times, I gave up. I went home, back to New York. But Hinch persevered for the full 3 days of what became known as Woodstock. Finally, with 500,000 people attending, it changed the music world, and Hinch was there. A couple of years later, there was a prison riot in a town called Attica, up near the Canadian border. Just another American jail uprising about overcrowding and about racism. That's what it seemed. But Hinch thought this one was different, so he flew up to cover it. And he was right. It was very different. The uprising quickly became a deadly siege, the worst in American history, with at least 39 men killed, mostly prisoners and hostages, shot by state and local police. Now, Hinch not only reported on that event brilliantly, but he joined a committee of journalists who helped negotiate the peace settlement inside the prison. Now, all this was Derryn Nigel Hinch in his colourful youth, his formative years, long before he became a TV star, a radio legend and the human headline. But let me finish this eulogy with one final story. In 1974, Hinch and I joined the travelling Canberra Press Corps on a trip through North America with Prime Minister Gough Whitlam and Margaret Whitlam on Air Force One. In Ottawa, Hinch and I had adjoining hotel rooms, and it was a Saturday night, I remember. A Whitlam staffer unexpectedly knocked on our doors to say that one of the Canberra journos had pulled out of the next morning's trip down to Niagara Falls. So there was now a free seat. He tossed a coin, and I won. I should have been nervous. It meant that Hinch would have to fly to Ottawa on the RAAF plane alone and wait for the rest of us to return by bus from the Niagara Falls. For the rest of us, it was a fantastic day, relaxing, full of colour, quotable quotes from the Whitlams. So I felt a bit guilty telling Hinch what he'd missed by being stuck in the plane. "So what did you do for 4 hours locked up in the plane?" I asked him. He said, with a twinkle in his eye, as Hinch would, he'd had a silver service lunch on the plane with copious French champagne. Then, against the strictest rules, he'd persuaded a Canadian airport worker to drive him to the airport news agency. There he found the Toronto newspapers awash with stories from a Frank Sinatra concert the previous night. Sinatra had told his audience that ridiculous Aussie unions, led by Bob Hawke, had banned his recent departure from Sydney until he apologised for calling journalists bums and parasites, hookers and broads. Sinatra had totally unloaded on Australia. Hinch grabbed these sensational comments as though he'd been at the Toronto concert. He filed them to all his newspapers. He got headlines everywhere and celebrated with another bottle of Qantas bubbly on the plane. Gough and Margaret at Niagara Falls barely made the inside pages, but that's life. As Dermot mentioned earlier, Hinch got himself into trouble regularly by unflattering comments that he made after public figures had died at times like this. Why can't we be honest about the dearly departed when they depart? He used to ask. Why can't we tell the truth? So he did, warts and all. Fair enough. So let me say a couple of things about Hinch. Hinch had some strange quirks. At a restaurant, for example, he would always insist on the seat facing the door. Always. That's so I can see if someone's about to shoot me, he used to say, or belt me over the head. It was always the case. He'd say, what do you want that seat for? So I can see who's coming in. Towards the end, he accepted that he was a practising alcoholic, as we mentioned tonight, and a practising atheist, so he wouldn't expect to be sitting up there listening to this today. He found, in those last few weeks when I spoke to him on the phone, he found Donald Trump appalling, as he did Pauline Hanson. Hinch went to jail for his convictions, as we all know. He always fought for battlers and for underdogs. Yet, strangely enough, I never understood, he could never really understand the plight of Aboriginal people and the need for reconciliation. It was his blind spot, if you like. He was against the Voice referendum. He wouldn't have much cared for today's welcome mark, as beautiful as it was, welcome to country. It's all overdone, he used to say. I tried to get him to go bush with me to see these shameful conditions in outback camps. He said he would, but somehow he never did. But in his last year as a senator, I asked Hinch if he could get some federal government money for the Humpty Dumpty Foundation, a fantastic charity, which was trying to bring medical care to sick kids, Aboriginal kids, in the Territory. So Hinch listened, he nodded, and he hit Malcolm Turnbull up for $200,000. $200,000, which we got. He could be contrary. But anyone who knew him knows that he would have absolutely loved the idea of a state funeral today. So thanks to the Victorian government for doing it. For a shit-stirring kid from Taranaki, a quaint town best known for its forgotten world highway, he used to tell me, forgotten world highway. A state funeral in this city that he called home and which he loved would have made him very proud, I think would have made him smile. Now there's only one other thing extra, I think, that he would have demanded today, and that's a standing ovation. So let's give it to Hinch. As we say this last goodbye, please, a standing ovation for Hinch. Thank you.